The Little Pig Robinson by Beatrix Potter. Chapter 1. When I was a child, I used to go to the seaside for the holidays. We stayed in a little town where there was a harbor and fishing boats and fishermen. They sailed away to catch herrings in nets. When the boats came back home again, some had only caught a few herrings. Others had caught so many that they could not all be unloaded on the quay. Then horses and carts were driven into the shallow water at low tide to meet the heavily laden boats. The fish were shoveled over the side of the boat into the carts and taken to the railway station, where a special train of fish trucks was waiting. Great was the excitement when the fishing boats returned with a good catch of herrings. Half of the people in town ran down to the quay, including cats. There was a white cat called Susan who never missed meeting the boats. She belonged to the wife of an old fisherman named Sam. The wife's name was Betsy. She had rheumatics, and she had no family except Susan and 5 hens. Betsy sat by the fire. Her back ached. She said, "Ow, ow," whenever she had to put coal on and stir the pot. Susan sat opposite to Betsy. She felt sorry for Betsy. She wished she knew how to put the coal on and stir the pot. All day long they sat by the fire while Sam was away fishing. They had a cup of tea and some milk. "Susan," said Betsy, "I can hardly stand up. Go to the front gate and look out for Master's boat." Susan went out and came back. 3 or 4 times she went out into the garden. At last, late in the afternoon, she saw the sails of the fishing fleet coming in over the sea. "Go down to the harbor, ask Master for 6 herrings. I will cook them for supper. Take my basket, Susan." Susan took the basket. Also, she borrowed Betsy's bonnet and little plaid shawl. I saw her hurrying down to the harbor. There she is. Other cats were coming out of the cottages and running down to the steep streets that led to the seafront. Also ducks. I remember that. They were most peculiar ducks with top knots that looked like tam o' shanter caps. Everybody was hurrying to meet the boats. Well, nearly everybody. I only met one person, a dog called Stumpy, who was going the opposite way. He was carrying a paper parcel in his mouth. Some dogs do not care for fish. Stumpy had been to the butcher's to buy mutton chops for himself and Bob and Percy and Miss Rose. Stumpy was a large, serious, well-behaved brown dog with a short tail. He lived with Bob the retriever and Percy the cat and Miss Rose who kept house. Stumpy had belonged to a very rich old gentleman, and when the old gentleman died, he left money to Stumpy, 10 shillings a week for the rest of Stumpy's life. So that was why Stumpy and Bob and Percy the cat all lived together in a pretty little house. Susan, with her basket, met Stumpy at the corner of Broad Street. Susan made a curtsy. She would have stopped to inquire after Percy, only she was in a hurry to meet the boat. Percy was lame. He had hurt his foot. It had been trapped under the wheel of a milk cart. Stumpy looked at Susan out of the corner of his eye. He wagged his tail, but he did not stop. He could not bow or say good afternoon for fear of dropping the parcel of mutton chops. He turned out of Broad Street into Woodbine Lane, where he lived. He pushed open the front door and disappeared into a house. Presently there was a smell of cooking, and I have no doubt that Stumpy and Bob and Miss Rose enjoyed their mutton chops. Percy could not be found at dinner time. He had slipped out of the window and, like all other cats in town, had gone to meet the fishing boats. Susan hurried along Broad Street and took the short cut to the harbor, down a steep flight of steps. The ducks had wisely gone another way, round by the seafront. The steps were too steep and slippery for anyone less sure-footed than a cat. Susan went down quickly and easily. There were 43 steps, rather dark and slimy, between high backs of houses. A smell of ropes and pitch and a good deal of noise came up from below. At the bottom of the steps was the quay, or landing place, beside the inner harbor. The tide was out. There was no water. The vessels rested on the dirty mud. Several ships were moored beside the quay. Others were anchored inside the breakwater. Near the steps, coal was being unloaded from 2 grimy colliers called the Marjorie Daw of Sunderland and the Jenny Jones of Cardiff. Men ran along the planks with wheelbarrowfuls of coal. Coal scoops were swung ashore by cranes and emptied with loud thumping and rattling. Farther along the quay, with another ship called the Pound of Candles, was taking a mixed cargo on board. Bales, casks, packing cases, barrels, all manner of goods were being stowed into the hold. Sailors and stevedores shouted, chains rattled and clanked. Susan waited for an opportunity to slip past the noisy crowd. She watched a case of cider that bobbed and swung in the air on its passage from quay to the deck of the Pound of Candles. A yellow cat who sat in the rigging was also watching the cask. The rope ran through the pulley. The cask went down bobbity onto the deck, where a sailor-man was waiting for it. Said the sailor down below, "Look out! Mind your head, young sir! Stand out of the way!" "Wee, wee, wee!" grunted a small pink pig scampering round the deck of the Pound Candles. The yellow cat in the rigging watched the small pink pig. The yellow cat in the rigging looked across at Susan on the quay. The yellow cat winked. Susan was surprised to see a pig on board a ship, but she was in a hurry. She threaded her way along the quay amongst coal and cranes, and men wheeling hand trucks, and noises and smells. She passed the fish auction and fish boxes and fish sorters and barrels that women were filling with herrings and salt. Seagulls swooped and screamed. Hundreds of fish boxes and tons of fresh fish were being loaded into the hold of a small steamer. Susan was glad to get away from the crowd, down a much shorter flight of steps onto the shore of the outer harbor. The ducks arrived soon afterwards, waddling and quacking, and old Sam's boat, the Betsy Timmins, last of the herring fleet and heavy laden, came in round the breakwater and drove her blunt nose into the shingle. Sam was in high spirits. He had had a big catch. He and his mate and 2 lads commenced to unload their fish into the carts, as the tide was too low to float the fishing boat up to the quay. The boat was full of herrings. But good luck or bad luck, Sam never failed to throw a handful of herrings to Susan. "Here's for the 2 old girls and a hot supper. Catch them, Susan. Honest now, here's a broken fish for you. Now take the others to Betsy." The ducks were dabbling and gobbling. The seagulls were screaming and swooping. Susan climbed the steps with her basket of herrings and went back home by back streets. Old Betsy cooked 2 herrings for herself and Susan, another 2 for Sam's supper when he came in. Then she went to bed with a hot bottle wrapped in a flannel petticoat to help her rheumatics. Sam ate his supper and smoked a pipe by the fire, and then he went to bed. But Susan sat a long time by the fire, considering. She considered many things: fish and ducks and Percy with a lame foot and dogs that ate mutton chops and the yellow cat on the ship and the pig. Susan thought it strange to see a pig upon a ship called the Pound of Candles. The mice peeped out under the cupboard door. The cinders fell together on the hearth. Susan purred gently in her sleep and dreamed of fish and pigs. She could not understand that pig on board a ship, but I know all about him. Chapter 2. You remember the song about the owl and the pussycat and their beautiful pea-green boat? How they took some honey and plenty of money wrapped up in a fine 5-pound note. They sailed away for a year and a day to the land where the bong tree grows, and there in a wood a piggy wig stood with a ring at the end of his nose. With a ring at the end of his nose. Now I'm going to tell you the story of that pig and why he went to live in the land of the bong tree. When that pig was little, he lived in Devonshire with his aunts, Miss Dorcas and Miss Porkis, at a farm called Piggery Porcombe. Their cozy thatched cottage was in an orchard at the top of the steep red Devonshire lane. The soil was red, the grass was green, and far away below in the distance they could see red cliffs and a bit of bright blue sea. Ships with white sails sailed over the sea into the harbour of Stymouth. I have often remarked that the Devonshire farms have very strange names. If you have ever seen Piggery Porcombe, you would think that the people who lived there were very queer too. Aunt Dorcas was a stout, speckled pig who kept hens, and Aunt Porkis was a large, smiling black pig who took in washing. We shall not hear very much about them in this story. They led prosperous, uneventful lives, and their end was bacon. But their nephew Robinson had the most peculiar adventures that ever happened to a pig. Little Pig Robinson was a charming little fellow, pinky white with small blue eyes, fat cheeks and a double chin, and a turned-up nose with a real silver ring in it. Robinson could see that ring if he shut one eye and squinted sideways. He was always contented and happy. All day long he ran about the farm singing little songs to himself and grunting, wee, wee, wee. His aunts missed those little songs sadly after Robinson had left them. Wee, 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 he answered when anybody spoke to him. Wee, 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 listening with his head on one side and one eye screwed up. Robinson's old aunts fed him and petted him and kept him on trot. Robinson, Robinson, called Aunt Dorcas. Come quick, I hear a hen clucking. Fetch me the egg, don't break it now. Wee, 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 answered Robinson like a little Frenchman. Robinson, Robinson, I've dropped a clothes peg. Come and pick it up for me, called Aunt Porkis from the drying green, she being almost too fat to stoop down and pick up anything. "We," answered Robinson. Both the aunts were very, very stout, and the stiles in the neighborhood of Steinmouth are narrow. The footpath from Piggery Porcombe crosses many fields, a red-trodden track between short green grasses and daisies, and wherever the footpath crosses over from one field to another field, there is sure to be a stile in the hedge. "It is not me that is too stout, it is the stiles that are too thin," said Aunt Dorcas to Aunt Porcus. "Could you manage to squeeze through them if I stayed at home?" "I could not. Not for 2 years I could not," replied Aunt Porcus. "Aggravating it is, aggravating of that carrier man to go and upset his donkey cart that day before market day, and eggs at 2 and 2 a dozen. How far do you call it to walk all the way round by the road instead of crossing fields?" 4 miles if it's one," sighed Aunt Porcus, "and me using my last bit of soap. However will we get our shopping done? The donkey says the cart will take a week to mend." "Don't you think you could squeeze through the stiles if you went before dinner?" "No, I don't. I would stick fast, and so would you," said Aunt Porcus. "Don't you think we might venture," commented Aunt Dorcas. "Venture to send Robinson by the footpath to Steinmouth," finished Aunt Porcus. We," answered Robinson. "I scarcely like to send him alone, though he is sensible for his size." We," answered Robinson. "I scarcely like to send him alone, though he's sensible." "Oh, sorry. But there was nothing else to be done," said Aunt Dorcas. So Robinson was popped into the wash tub with the last bit of soap. He was scrubbed and dried and polished as bright as a new pin. Then he was dressed in a little blue cotton frock and knickers and instructed to go shopping to Steinmouth with a big market basket. In the basket were 2 dozen eggs, a bunch of daffodils, 2 spring cauliflowers, also Robinson's dinner of bread and jam sandwiches, the eggs and flowers and vegetables he must sell in the market, and bring back various other purchases from shopping. "Now take care of yourself in Steinmouth, nephew Robinson. Beware of gunpowder and ship's cooks and pantichin corns, and sausages, and shoes, and ships, and sealing wax. Remember the blue bag, the soap, the darning wool." "What was the other thing?" said Aunt Dorcas. "The darning wool, the soap, the blue bag, the yeast. What was the other thing?" said Aunt Porcus. We," answered Robinson. "The blue bag, the soap, the yeast, the darning wool, the cabbage seed. That's 5, and there ought to be 6. It was 2 more than 4 because it was too many to tie knots in the corners of his hanky to remember by. 6 to buy, it should be. Oh, I have it," said Aunt Porcus. "It was tea. Tea, blue bag, soap, darning wool, yeast, cabbage seed. You will buy most of them at Mr. Mumby's. Explain about the carrier, Robinson. Tell him we'll bring the washing and some more vegetables next week." We," answered Robinson, setting off with the big basket. Aunt Dorcas and Aunt Porcus stood in the porch. They watched him safely out of sight, down the field and through the first of the many stiles. When they went back to their household tasks, they were grunty and snappy with each other because they were uneasy about Robinson. "I wish we had not let him go, you and your tiresome blue bag," said Aunt Dorcas. "Blue bag, indeed! It was your darning wool and eggs," grumbled Aunt Porcus. "Bother that carrier man and his donkey cart. Why could not he keep out of the ditch until after market day?" And there is little Robinson on his way to the market.